There's no phrase U.S. politicians love to repeat more than support the troops. This pledge is hammered into the American psyche at every turn, commemorated by several national holidays where those same politicians give big ceremonial speeches declaring their love for veterans. But a dark hidden history shows that they're no friend to service members, but rather their greatest enemy. An easy way to prove this is to look at how quickly they betray and abandon their soldiers after ruining their lives, and even after using them as literal lab rats. The Army was conducting experiments on enlisted soldiers after the use of chemical weapons in the first major clash of empires, World War I. They were hoping to prove the bizarre idea that black soldiers' skin would be more resistant to chemical weapons, so they could put them on the front lines. Declassified Pentagon documents show these race-based chemical tests occurred between 1942 and 1944, during which around 60,000 people were experimented on with skin and lung-burning chemicals like mustard gas, nerve gas, and lewisite, a chemical agent that causes severe chemical burns upon skin contact in the form of giant, fluid-filled blisters. Testing on African Americans didn't prove their magical skin theory, so they took a group of Puerto Rican U.S. soldiers on a training exercise in Panama, where they were made to sit in a jungle while they were sprayed with chemical weapons, with no protection, all to see if their magical Puerto Rican skin would be resilient to it. The Pentagon brass were only concerned with documenting the immediate effects. They completely ignored the long-term impact of these weapons, a litany of life-threatening illnesses including leukemia, skin cancer, and emphysema. The tens of thousands of U.S. soldiers subjected to these racist tests started experiencing chronic symptoms immediately afterwards. One problem: they couldn't get medical treatment because they were sworn to secrecy. Their commanders threatened them with jail time if they even talked about the tests, and even had all their medical records destroyed. To the Army, these tests simply never occurred, and thus the military was not liable for any health-related problems. When the human experiments were declassified in 1993, the U.S. government promised to track down the veteran test subjects and inform them that they could finally get compensation and treatment. But in 2015, NPR found that in over 20 years, they had only located and compensated 610 victims out of 60,000. But many have been fighting for compensation for most of their lives, only to receive rejection letters saying there's not enough evidence of the tests being responsible for their health issues. World War II veteran and test subject Harry Bollinger received numerous rejection letters, saying his chronic breathing problems and eczema wasn't the military's fault, to which he said, "That's going to be on my tombstone. U.S. Navy, guinea pig," adding, "That won't be too long now, probably." He died on March 14, 2016. Having given up on getting compensation from the government. Not guaranteed health care, living veterans and their families spend upwards of $500 or more per month on medications to treat the side effects. But 1944 wasn't the end of the heinous use of soldiers as lab rats. A decade later, in 1953, the Army's Operation Top Hat at Fort McClellan, Alabama, gassed enlisted soldiers with various chemical weapons, just to test out decontamination methods. The soldiers were not informed of the tests, asked for their consent, nor given any follow-up medical treatment. Throughout the 60s, too, they continuously gassed Navy sailors under Project Shad, testing biological and chemical agents on military personnel aboard ships. Around 6,000 were unsuspecting guinea pigs. The government didn't even acknowledge the test took place until the year 2000. But testing went far beyond chemical and biological weapons. While today there's an epidemic of suicides due to the government's unwillingness to address the issue of post-traumatic stress disorder, they used to subject traumatized veterans to cruel psychological experiments, including bone-breaking electroshock therapy, induced comas, and most disturbingly, full-blown lobotomies, a violent procedure that entails destroying the frontal lobe of the brain. In 2013, the Wall Street Journal exposed these experiments that occurred in the late 40s and early 50s on the most vulnerable veterans displaying normal reactions to brutal combat, those diagnosed with depression and distress from war. They even lobotomized veterans with the so-called illness of homosexuality. Via the Wall Street Journal. Often the surgery left them little more than overgrown children, unable to care for themselves. Many suffered seizures, amnesia, and loss of motor skills. Like 90-year-old Roman Tritz, a World War II bomber pilot who was lobotomized after coming home with combat stress. Lobotomies were performed on at least 2,000 soldiers like Tritz. Psychiatrists confirm that many of these lobotomy patients exhibited symptoms simply characterized today as PTSD, which is diagnosed in hundreds of thousands of veterans. There was never any accountability for destroying the lives and minds of thousands of soldiers. Families were told that their loved one, now cured with this experimental treatment, would have to be cared for like a child for the rest of their lives. After physically removing minds, the CIA enlisted in another mission to try to control them. Like something out of a twisted X-Files plot, Cold War CIA Director Alan Dulles activated MKUltra, a decades-long research program that used unwitting test subjects to carry out experiments using psychedelic drugs and extreme isolation, all in an insane attempt to find a truth serum and control minds. The government turned to its usual lab rats, hundreds of unsuspecting American citizens, many of whom were prisoners, addicts, or mentally ill, and of course countless young enlisted soldiers. Government officials employed hallucinogens, torture, and an array of other horrific measures to try to brainwash individuals. The drug-induced mind control tests under MKUltra were administered by a mad chemist named Sidney Gottlieb. On behalf of the CIA, Gottlieb gave LSD, mescaline, ketamine, and PCP to thousands of human subjects. Often they'd become ill for days. Many were plagued with PTSD, others with permanent psychosis. The most incredible fact is that these psychological experiments, which seem like they were devised in Nazi Germany, actually did have Nazi scientists working at the CIA at the time under what was called Operation Paperclip. The CIA aggressively recruited thousands of Nazi scientists into their research programs, giving them new identities in America along with protection and big paychecks. Comforting thought. The exact number of victims and extent of MKUltra experimentation is unknown, because most of the documents related to the program were destroyed by the CIA in 1973. These drug-induced psychological experiments were not limited to MKUltra, but implemented in broader tests on service members that spanned decades. Between 1948 and 1975, a similarly disturbing program was being carried out by the U.S. Army at Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland, where 7,800 soldiers were being secretly tested with more than 250 chemical and biological agents, including hallucinogens, LSD, PCP, and BZ, as well as sarin gas, mustard gas, and 3 nerve gases developed by the Nazis, including Frank Rochelle, who was tortured for months at Edgewood when he was just 20 years old. He volunteered for what he thought was testing out new battle gear. Instead, he was given a chemical that drugged him for 3 days, experiencing horrifying hallucinations that made him try to cut out his own freckles. Although medical records indicate he went through a 3rd trial of tests, he has no recollection of it. He now struggles with visions, severe memory loss, and PTSD. In some cases, electrical devices were even implanted in humans like dogs to try to control their behavior.
Our government has not fulfilled their duty. They have a duty to find and recognize every person, and they got a duty to give them medical treatment.
They're hoping that we die off. You apply, you get turned on, and it just goes on for years and years. And they want to wear us down. They want to use young men as guinea pigs and throw them away.
In 2009, 6 veteran test subjects of Edgewood Arsenal fought back against the CIA, including Rochelle, claiming the government provided no compensation or health care when the trials ended. Virtually all Edgewood-related health claims have been denied. Many don't speak out, believing they're still bound to secrecy oaths, and others have no recollection of being involved in the experiments in the first place. According to military records cited by Military Times, officials gave participants, quote, unnamed liquids that made them forget the entire event. At the same time soldiers were getting dosed with mind-altering drugs, they were also getting dosed with high levels of radiation under a Cold War program that used service members as nuclear guinea pigs. Having already dropped 2 atomic bombs on the civilian cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, the U.S. government had ample time to study the deadly effects of radiation. Yet over the next 3 decades, the newly dominant U.S. empire decided to sacrifice hundreds of thousands of its own soldiers to test the limits of its most powerful weapon. After World War II, the U.S. state claimed the Marshall Islands in the Pacific Ocean, home to 68,000 people at the time. In 1946, the U.S. carried out Operation Crossroads at Bikini Atoll in the Marshall Islands, the first of hundreds of nuclear tests it would carry out using unwitting human subjects. The Baker test blast was the detonation of a 21-kiloton nuclear bomb 90 feet underwater, causing enormous damage and widespread radioactive contamination. Navy ships full of sailors were specifically placed in the fallout radius. According to a lawsuit, every single person aboard at least one vessel died at a young age from radiogenic disease. 8 years later, the U.S. military conducted Castle Bravo, exploding a hydrogen bomb a whopping 1,000 times more powerful than the atomic bombs dropped on Japan on Bikini Atoll, exposing thousands more servicemen as well as tens of thousands in surrounding communities to radioactive fallout. According to a 2012 UN report, the 67 tests covered the Marshall Islands with a radioactive plume that caused near irreversible environmental contamination and loss of culture and livelihoods for native people who faced indefinite displacement after being forced to evacuate. According to residents, some of the country's islands were completely vaporized during the tests. Tens of thousands died from radiation-related illness, according to the Institute of Medicine, with thousands more civilian victims abandoned. At the same time across the world, more than 200,000 American soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines were forced to partake in a series of open-air nuclear blasts in the Nevada desert, named Operation Desert Rock. The unwitting soldiers that participated were callously called ground grunts, ordered to sit in ditches dangerously close to the explosions with no protective gear. They wore badges to monitor their exposure levels so the government could test what grotesque results arose from their new weapons. In 1957, the U.S. government carried out the most controversial and deadly of all the Desert Rock tests, Operation Plum Bob, a concentrated series of 29 nuclear blasts involving 16,000 soldiers. To illustrate just how the military commanders viewed their soldiers, they also tested hundreds of pigs in the same experiment. One would think if the results of such a potentially deadly test were so uncertain, they'd test it on the pigs before young soldiers. During this nuclear dystopia, radioactive fallout poisoned not only soldiers but countless civilians in communities from Utah to Arizona. All the while, the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission assured the population, there is no danger. It wasn't until 1980 that a congressional subcommittee on oversight and investigations concluded all evidence suggesting that radiation was having harmful effects, be it on the sheep or the people, was not only disregarded, but actually suppressed. Joel Healy was a soldier in the Army when he witnessed Plum Bob. He realizes now that his own government did this to him on purpose, saying,
because I'm thinking, they spent a lot of money training me to be a soldier. They wouldn't intentionally put me in harm's way. And this is 1957. We dropped those bombs in Japan in 1945. So they've known for 12 years. Troops going into battle know that there's a very inherent risk that they may not be coming out.
Right.
Unless it's in a black bag. In this instance, they never said a word. And they knew it. Just a disgrace. I don't really like to talk about it. A lot of good men died.